Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. My name is Josh Blaser, and for our topic tonight, we are going to be talking about Digital Eclipse and how the studio has been making a name for themselves with doing these kinds of museum-quality collections of classic games, as well as their thoughts on kind of the state of game preservation, which is a very big topic and one that I'm always interested in discussing. So please welcome from the studio, Editorial Director Chris Kohler. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yep, thank you for agreeing to come on. This is definitely a topic I am interested in. For those of you who don't know, I am a huge proponent of game preservation and making sure that games are available, beyond just, 2 to 3 years of their life. So
Yeah.
it is definitely great to speak with you. So, to get the ball rolling, since it's your first time on the cast, could you talk a little bit about, who you are, what is your kind of background, and of course, for people who don't know what Digital Eclipse is, like kind of like what's like their elevator pitch?
Okay, so I'll start with myself. So before joining Digital Eclipse, I had about a 25-ish year career in the video game media space. Starting when I was like, how far do you want me to go back? I started when I was 16 years old, doing freelance for On America magazine, and also a very short-lived but amazing magazine called Game On USA, which was a very early attempt to do a US magazine that was all about Japanese video games. So it was totally what I wanted to do. That magazine shuttered, but I ended up freelancing around for a lot of different places. Ended up doing freelance for Wired magazine, and that in 2005 we ended up starting Game Life, which was the first ever vertical devoted to video games for Wired, that ran on the web, and did that for a long time. Was at Kotaku for a few years after that, and then had this amazing opportunity to go to Digital Eclipse and start working on as you say, these collections or re-releases of classic video games that were really like editorially driven in some cases. So, I mean, what we've announced recently is called the Making of Karateka. It's we're calling an interactive documentary all about the creation of the debut title from Jordan Mechner, who would go on to create the Prince of Persia series, really showing how Jordan got his start in the industry. And it's less about like re-releasing the game itself, which of course is very much part of the product, but it's about using the medium of the video game to kind of do what I did for 25 years, which is to, tell these great stories about the history of games, but to do it in an interactive way, which is really exciting. Digital Eclipse got started right around the same time I did back in the mid 90s, in 1994. Digital Eclipse was the first game, developer to actually use emulation in a commercial product. It was really, 94 was before, many people had used emulators on their computers at all, to do anything. But essentially, in an era in which, if you bought a game of Pac-Man for your computer or something like that, that was like somebody who, looking at Pac-Man and like designing a Windows version of it based on their observation of the arcade game, whereas Digital Eclipse was like, let's use this emulation technology and take the actual code of the actual arcade game and have that running on a different platform. And at that point, that was revolutionary. And since then, Digital Eclipse has grown that, it's founded on the idea of treating the classic games with the respect that they deserve as these foundational works of art on which this whole medium is built. And so that, it's like to use emulation rather than simply recreate something was the start of things. And then you see Digital Eclipse starting to add in things like, interviews with the developers and scans or of arcade flyers and things like that. And just sort of building up to what we're doing now, calling it the interactive documentary, in which it's no longer just like games and bonus content. It's really a full cohesive package that kind of takes you through the history of this game, and hopefully, gets people to appreciate something more that they ordinarily wouldn't even have thought of or heard of in the past.
And definitely a loss of their end. I do want to, give praise to the studio for their collections because it has been, again, as someone here who likes to treat video games with that level of respect and to give it that level of credence that it's important to study them beyond just watching footage. Definitely, round of applause to Digital Eclipse.
Well, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the making of Karateka also. I think you're gonna like it.
And of course, as you said, like you also last year, Digital Eclipse released the 50th anniversary of the Atari, and just the amount of work that went into that. And there's definitely a lot of things that we can start. I'm just like trying to figure out the best way to go. So, I guess the first thing, one thing I was curious about, because at the time of us recording this, I just did a podcast discussion. I have a weekly show, and we were talking about the state of game preservation and kind of all the legal loopholes and troubles that go into it. So one thing that I was curious about with like how like Digital Eclipse operates, when like you're interested in like putting together one of these, as you said, like, interactive museum, is this something that like you reach out to the respective parties, or do the respective parties like kind of reach out saying we want celebrate our game, we want to put something together, and do they go to Digital Eclipse? Like how does like this kind of get started?
It goes both ways. I mean, we're just constantly having discussions with all of our partners in the industry. Occasionally it's us saying, "Hey, like, there's an opportunity to do something with this franchise that you own," and so we're sort of, you know, actively going and pitching them something that they might not have considered. And then sometimes it's them coming to us and saying, "Okay, we want to bring back such and such franchise. Give us your pitch for how you would do it." And so, so when you look at things like Blizzard Arcade Collection or Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga Collection, or Atari 50, those sort of generally they have different origins as far as like who thought of it, or but it kind of starts out in that pitch process, and then with a lot of back and forth between us, we figure out what that final product is going to be. In the case of the Making of Karateka, it's the first entry in what we're calling the Gold Master Series. And the Gold Master Series is a self-published, independently produced line of interactive documentary style games that we're essentially assuming all the risk ourselves. What typically has not happened in this business is we, as the developer publisher of this, are going out and we are licensing the games, so that we're paying the license fee rather than the publisher coming to us and we do work for hire for them. We're kind of controlling our own destiny with these. And what's so important about that is because they get to be editorially independent. We just get to do what we think is the best thing for these games, versus it having to be, at best a collaboration or a back and forth, or at worst, somebody coming in and telling us, well, this is what we want, and us saying, maybe that's not the best way to do it, but that ultimately we kind of have to do it that way. So this definitely is going to give us more freedom to really put these things out there as a proof of concept, with the Making of Karateka and later entries in the Gold Master Series that you're going to hear about later, as in terms of like us really showing the world what we think, how we think we can evolve, how we discuss and present and revive classic games.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point for this next question, because as you said, like in like the intro, like when we look at kind of like the bonus, like the information that you're trying to present in these collections in the Gold Master series, a lot of this has oftentimes been relegated to the bonus feature, the optional stuff that maybe even like less than 10% of the people who play these games will ever get to see. And in a lot of cases, a lot of consumers and maybe even some publishers and developers, they don't view it as, something that's worth exploring. I remember like the Sega Master Collection, like for PlayStation 2 era, and like one of the things I loved about that was like having like the old scans of the manuals, having, talks with the people who make these games. And I guess to kind of put this into a question for you, when we look at kind of like this, like the wide spectrum of these kinds of remasters, and not just from Digital Eclipse, or from like other studios as well, it's definitely a very wide line of quality. Like some of them, again, is just here's 10 games, nothing's done to them, maybe very little even is done to make the emulation good. And then, of course, we have, like, on the other end of the spectrum, we have stuff like Digital Eclipse, where you get, documentaries, you get the interactivity. So, I guess for the studio, what do you think, like, needs to be in, like, a remaster or in, like, one of these kinds of, like, museum-level quality collections to, I guess, like, make it, I guess, both marketable and something that the consumer will appreciate?
I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to go about this. I mean, first of all, I think that anything that can be done to take a game that is not, legally available and get it available and just get it available to people. There's something to be said for that. That is admirable in and of itself, just to get it online and playable again. But what we have realized is that, like, it's it can be doing a something of a disservice to certain major games to put them out there with no context. And so if we want to, having them available is great, but the audience for that is literally just going to be who is out there who remembers that game, who's going to go search for that game and then want to play that game again. So you have a limited audience for something like that. We want to grow that audience. We don't just want to take, even when it's, when we're talking about something like, the Ninja Turtles games for Konami. I mean, that was a unicorn, because the Ninja Turtles series is, still so popular with adults and kids. The games are still so good. It was going to be a slam dunk no matter what. But we really wanted to go the extra mile and see what we could potentially do to really make it feel like something that was just more than, well, the games are back available. And so we went into Konami's archives, and in fact found that Konami has really extensive, amazing archives over there in Japan. And they had tons and tons of design documents from the original Turtles games. That wasn't all we included. We included, soundtracks. You can listen to the soundtracks. There's comic book covers and screenshots from the TV show and magazine ad scans and stuff like that. So we weren't just reliant on Konami. We went out and found other stuff ourselves. Now, that said, with the design documents, they were all written in, like, Japanese handwriting, like somebody just doing really, really tiny chicken scratch, Japanese handwriting, basically. And they were cool to look at, especially because so many of those design documents had these great illustrations from the game creators of, sketches of how the turtle sprites would look and things like that. But to really go the extra mile, we had all of them translated into English and, developed essentially a custom system for that game where we could float the translations on top of the design documents, so that even when you zoom in, the translations, because of course the design documents are not just like written out line by line on a piece of paper, it's just sketches and notes and arrows and this and that and the other. And so we had to essentially have, like, floating little text boxes that we could arbitrarily place so that you could see how the translation, I mean, it was something that had just never been done, for a video game release. But it just made it so special and so fascinating, to just sit there for hours and go through all those documents and have that same experience, that we did when we were going through it. And I think a lot of, developers might have just maybe picked out the 10 best documents and put them in an art gallery to look at. Whereas we were like, oh, it's 1,000 pages. Let's get all 1,000 pages in there. We want to make it an archive. But that still is an example of here are the games and then here's the bonus content proposition, which is fine for certain releases, depending on what sort of content you have. But for Atari 50, which we then, we did Atari 50, sort of overlapped actually Turtles a little bit, and then it came out very shortly after. The concept was, well, there already exist these Atari collections, and we'd been doing work actually with Making of Karateka prior to even getting started on Atari 50. So we were already sort of sketching out how this conceptually, a chronological timeline in which the bonus material is not just bonus, but everything from the design documents to writings of the designers to cut content or in development material or playable prototypes, all that kind of stuff. If we figure out what the order of that is and lay it out chronologically, then essentially and we support that with researched text all throughout, then what you're getting, rather than here's a gallery of some design documents and they're all kind of out of order and you don't really know what you're looking at, what you get is a contextualized narrative now. And it's akin to sitting down and watching a Netflix series documentary about something, except because it's all user controlled and interactive, there's all these different branching things that you can go and explore, and you can learn about the making of this game, on your own time, doing exactly what you want to do. But the really important thing is, we take these games, and the Making of Karateka has like 14 different playable games in it. When you talk about, of course, the original Apple II retail version of Jordan Mechner's Karateka, but also the ports of that, but then also his unfinished prototypes of that, which have significant differences, and also some of the unpublished games, because Jordan Mechner made this game when he was a teenager, so there's these like unpublished projects that he was working on his Apple II that lead into Karateka. They're part of the story, even though it's like a clone of Atari's Asteroids. But you can play that as well. And again, instead of just taking it and plunking it into a bonus menu, because it's all chronological, when you look at the design documents and you play the prototypes and you read the narrative and you watch the video featurettes that we have, about an hour of video, you do all that kind of stuff and more, because we've got things like, you can watch a playthrough of Karateka on the Apple II, and you can jump in at any time, chapter select to jump to an important part of the game, director's commentary from Jordan Mechner and his father, Francis Mechner, who composed the soundtrack to Karateka, who was one of the motion capture actors, basically, that Jordan filmed. This is 1984. He filmed them on Super 8 film and traced the film frames to put rotoscoped animation in a video game for the first time. You learn about how that works. There's an interactive rotoscope theater where you can see the frames of film and the tracing paper and the sprites, and you can see how it all matches up. And you can see literally like video of Jordan's dad running around in the woods behind their house wearing his wife's karate outfit. And you can literally see how that real life footage is just mirrored in the final Apple II game. And we can do that in an interactive way, like Photoshop, basically letting you turn the layers on and off to play with it and change the opacity and stuff like that. Start the animation, stop the animation. So you could get lost looking at those animations as well. So it's like, once you kind of, as you're doing all of this stuff, ideally, you are building up more and more of an appreciation for this classic game, which a lot of people don't know about. And a lot of people really don't know about Karateka or why it was important or what kind of an impact that it had, because it sold a ton, but more importantly, it made so many innovations in terms of in terms of animation, in terms of cinematic elements in a game, in terms of music, in terms of using video games to tell a movie-like story, that it was hugely influential. And so we want people to go away, with a heightened appreciation, not only for the game itself, but for the legacy that it had, which can kind of tend to become erased. And so we want it. We're everything in the kitchen sink is basically in the Making of Karateka, as far as whatever ideas that we have where we can use the medium of the video game to tell the stories of video games. Like we're putting them all in because we want to get it out there as a proof of concept.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a lot to branch off from that point. And one thing, I guess 2 points. I will talk a little more about the importance of this next, but one thing that I want to go back to, and one thing that you've been talking about in terms of making these collections, palatable to the general audience. Mm-hmm, for a lot of these classic games, I'm sure everyone watching this record, I'm sure you're well aware of, a lot of them can often be very painful to go back to and play.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we look at something like the Calbone collection with the arcade side of things. And of course, having limited continues, the whole insert coin thing from back in the day. And a lot of that, I think, has kind of hurt some of these games in terms of getting someone to play them today. And as you said earlier, like, one of the goals of these collections and the Gold Master series is that it's not just meant for someone who played that game 20, 30 years ago, who knows it imminently, but it's for someone who may have never even heard, they may not even have touched that controller. And what I want to ask you about with like Digital Eclipse's approach is, I guess, how does your studio kind of make these games something that can not only be appreciated just by watching it, but you can give the controller to someone who has never heard this game, who's never played it before, and they can at least try to appreciate it in a way that works in today's market.
Yeah, so I mean, well, Karateka at the time was also sort of a notoriously difficult or punishing game, because it wasn't entirely one-hit kills. I mean, that's I guess some arcade games actually did have just simple one-hit kills, whereas Karateka actually did have a life bar. So there was a little bit more fudge factor as far as like you can make mistakes, you can come back, but it was a notoriously difficult game. And of course, it's 1984, which means that you just bought Karateka. That's the one game you have. You've got an 8-hour summer day stretching ahead of you. There's nothing on TV because you don't have cable and cartoons don't come on until Saturday. You don't have an iPhone. So, I mean, kids in 84 will sit down with Karateka, they'll bash their heads against it until they, absolutely master it. But nope, people aren't going to do that in 2023. And so, again, I feel like it does this disservice to these games by, just putting them out there because you have to like give people entry points, and you have to like help people appreciate what this game was, and then beyond that, just help them cheat if that's what they want to do. So I mean, we have, and it's not just about cheating. We've got watch mode, where you can watch a playthrough of the game, and a lot of that is about just this idea of these games were hard. We want to create something that feels like a documentary, and part of that means showing people the full game playthrough, which is something they just access and watch. We have chapter select in there, so if you want to jump straight to the final boss fight or the encounter with Mariko the princess at the end of the game or whatever, you can jump exactly to that moment, and then you can watch that scene played out, or you can jump in at that time and play it for yourself. So, and we also have rewind and saving and loading. So a lot of Karateka is like, oh, I just played for a half an hour and oops, I just forgot to get into combat stance and this guy hit me and I died. Well, again, it's 2023. Go ahead and rewind. And really, it's funny because of course, with Prince of Persia, the Sands of Time, and the Dagger of Time, and the rewind function in that game, it's kind of thematically, it almost makes sense for it to even be there. But you can rewind and you can save and you can load and you can jump around basically. You can frame boost the game if you want to and make it run faster, which kind of does make it makes it a little, it changes the difficulty in certain ways, but it's like, we just want you to get in there and be able to kind of just play around with this. And we want to give you the tools that you can use to get in and start appreciating the game without having that barrier in front of you. But I have to say, like, as I've been working on this and playing Karateka and, you starting out using the tools and saving and loading and stuff like that, I got better and better at it. And so it actually is like more fun for me now. So like, again, like that's what I want to give to people, that coming out of this, after having messed around with it, you'll have more of an appreciation, and maybe you'll even think, what, I think I want to try to beat this game. And I'll tell you, it is way easier to beat these games using like a standard modern day like D-pad controller than it is to try to play it back in the day with an Apple II, joystick. I mean, I'm sure that made it like significantly more difficult than it needed to be.
Yeah. It is kind of interesting when we look back at some of these classic games in terms of like what aspects made them so difficult or what made them so infamous. Like as a good example, like, I bought the Konami collections for like Contra and went back and played the original Contra these days, and like today I can play that like reasonably well. I remember again like as you like dated all the old people watching this back in the 80s, could never play that game, and you also scared all the kids who may be watching this who can't imagine a time without an iPhone or being able to have easy access to the internet, because I have done that to a few kids when I talk about some of this stuff.
I feel like Contra is an example of a game that aged incredibly well. I even when Konami put out the Contra collection, when I was still at Kotaku, I wrote about it because I was just like, some games just don't age well, and they're really a product of their time. But I mean, maybe I'm dating myself. Maybe a younger person would have a lot of criticisms about the way that Contra works, and they wouldn't think that this is true. But I mean, I think it just aged like a fine wine. Like, I really think it the controls are still so smooth and intuitive, and it just feels like something that could come out today as like an indie side-scrolling shooting game or something like that on the lines with Cuphead. I felt that Contra did great. So I think it's a rare example, because I think the games that endured and could be put out today and just stand on their own, I think it's just such a short list.
Yep.
But the exciting thing is, and again, so what does that mean? I think from a lot of the perspective of a lot of publishers, people have these back catalogs. They're like, oh, well, we have, there's all these games that we own, but the good ones that we can still re-release are just like this little handful. And I think it hopefully what we're doing we should be able to take a game that hasn't particularly aged well, or maybe even wasn't that good when it came out. But through doing it in the interactive documentary style, the question is there a good story? Not just us, also look at limited run games and what they're doing with Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, that terribly reviewed 3DO game, considered one of the worst, game releases of all time. It's like, well, look, if it's that bad, there must be an incredible story behind it. And so like their release of that game, that's clearly what they're trying to do, is make it not about, no, we're not selling you this game. We're selling you this experience and this story, and the behind the scenes, and we're going to entertain you that way. And ironically, they'll probably, once you really start to appreciate something, it's something we found with Atari 50, the anniversary celebration, is that we had people coming in saying, I'm not really an Atari fan. I wasn't an Atari person. I didn't grow up with Atari. I skipped the Jaguar. But because, the way that you guys are doing this is, you're talking about the games, how they were developed, why they were developed, who made them, putting that human face on it. What were the limitations of the platform? What was this game trying to accomplish? Did it accomplish its goals? And you learn about that. And then you jump in, off the interactive timeline, and you start playing the game, and you jump back to the timeline, you appreciate it more. So it's not just about us wanting to do this in this fun way. It's literally about how do we, again, like it just comes back to that like respect, like how do we, give these games their best possible shot? And right now, we're feeling like it's to do it the way that we're doing it.
Mm-hmm. And what you said about kind of like the pool, like when people again think about these kinds of remasters, they think of something like, oh, let's just bring back, Mario for the umpteenth time, or pick any 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 game. And as you said, like games like that, you don't need to do anything else to sell them. And in some cases, as we saw like Square Enix, like it can make it worse if you try to, upscale the pixel or you change aspects of it. But for like the vast majority of these games, they really, like, again, as we were saying at the start, like for like someone like us, like people who grew up with these games, just having a collection of SNES platformers, early PC first-person shooters. That's enough. But that market is kind of a subset of people. And it is important, I think, as you said, like, kind of like the package of how you present this stuff is very important because it's how I think we get more people to check them out. Like, I know stuff like the MADE, like the Video Game Museum, and how they've set things up, to present their games like that. Like, again, as we've said, like, some games can easily stay on their own, but being able to present this not just with information, but having, as you said, the ability to watch, to jump in, chapter select, like, these are things like, again, we were talking about games 30 years ago, they would just be considered simple cheat codes, or it'll just be, that's how we view it. But it does feel like if we're talking about preserving, like, video game history like this, it does feel like it needs to be in there in order to get someone, again, I doubt that there's a huge market of people who are willing to go back and play through something like Friday the 13th, or Jaws, or pick any LJN game, just, raw like that. But again, if you could experience that game and have the ability to do a rewind or infinite lives or stuff like that, you can kind of get past the spikiness of these games. As you said with like plumbers don't wear ties. Like, I don't think there's a lot of people who want to play through that game from start to finish. But if you present it in a way that, as you said, it's more about the story rather than just playing this game as is, it makes it it allows you, as you said, to appreciate it more as as this product, as this endeavor, rather than just the game.
Yeah, I mean, we believe that, what would in a lot of other projects just be considered the bonus content can really be the main show. It can be the reason why people are coming in. And so that's precisely what we're trying to do. Again, as I said, like, with the Gold Master series, because it is independent, because it is self-published, we have the editorial discretion to put in whatever we want, and we're gonna, put in, I haven't even gone into, there's just so many ways of learning about, Karateka, like in this game. You can go along in the timelines, and as you're going along in the timelines, you'll see, old family photos of the Mechner family. You'll kind of learn about who these people were. You'll learn about like the Apple II and what that was like as a platform. And then you'll start seeing Jordan's original prototypes. You'll be able to jump in, play a little bit of them, and then jump back out, and you're still in the timeline, kind of continuing your journey. But there's things like there's a 15-minute audio podcast as part of this that's done by Kirk Hamilton. He is a very talented multi-instrumentalist himself, and also a podcast host. And what he does is, in his podcast called Strong Songs, is he breaks down elements of pop songs and things like that, and like talks about why a good song is good, what makes a good song good. And we have him applied all of his talents to analyzing Jordan's father, Francis Mechner's score, the leitmotif style score that he did for Karateka in an age where most games just didn't really have music. This Karateka had incredibly good music, original music, because, Francis Mechner brought all of that lifetime of experience, but he was a classical pianist, and he sort of brought all that in, and he really understood in a way that a lot of games at this point are just sort of being designed by one designer, programmer, kid who's sitting at the computer. Here you have a guy who at the time, I believe, was in his 50s, who was he's a behavioral psychologist, he's a classical pianist. He sees his son making this game, son wants help with music, and he comes in with this tremendous amount of expertise in how to pull off, Wagnerian leitmotif style approach, applies that to an Apple II game in 1984, and ends up creating this very brief soundtrack, but one that really does an incredible job on this limited hardware of enhancing the emotional impact of the game's story. And it really talks about how, it just gets into like, well, yeah, Karateka was, very influential, made all these leaps, but like, how did that happen? And it wasn't an accident. It was just this amazing confluence of so many different, it's a father and son story. And that's really what we want to get across, this beautiful father and son story of, the father with all of his life experience, knowing nothing about video games, the teenage kid programming video games, and rather than them being at loggerheads, like, I don't know how your relationship was with your dad when you were like 18, 19 years old, and wanting to separate away from your parents and go off to college and not have to think about living at home anymore. But like, Jordan and his father just had this beautiful relationship, this collaborative effort that they did to produce this game. And it's again, it's like, I start doing the research on this and I'm like, God, the story is fantastic. It's like, how do we tell this? We've got to get this out to people. And so to do it in this way, hopefully ends up being a very impactful way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about, with regards to like these collections and kind of like what Digital Eclipse is going to be doing in the future, because this is something that I was thinking about this when I was doing my show, and I wanted to make sure I ask you this question before I forget about it again. One of the like major challenges whenever we talk about like game preservation and these kinds of working with older IPs has to be like the IP ownership. As anyone who does or looks at game preservation, we all know kind of like the White Whale would be a game like No One Lives Forever, and all the horror stories of trying to get something like that going. With kind of like Digital Eclipse, like, what has been like, or has there been any kind of challenges in terms of like getting access to these IPs or working with them? And the reason why I ask this is I've interviewed both GOG and Farsight Studios. This would be like 5-6 years ago. And with both companies, we talked about kind of like that challenge of when working with an IP that literally like the company that made that game may not even be in existence anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's, speaking generally, there's so many things where it's like, gee, we'd love to do that game. We would love to include this. And you sort of follow the trail of copyrights down to, well, the company closed and nobody has any idea who owns this anymore. So and that kind of gets into this game preservation aspect, where the Video Game History Foundation just put out this study showing that 87% of classic games, which they define as games that came out prior to 2010, 87% of them are not commercially available. And what that, is for a lot of those, the rights are worked out and they're simply not commercially available, and maybe they will become commercially available in the future. But for many of those games, it is simply unlikely or impossible that they will ever be officially available again, because they are in whatever copyright limbo. Even if somebody owns the game itself, there might be other rights that were assigned, or somebody might have retained the copyright to the music, or who knows. And it's essentially just, it's never gonna happen. Which is why the Video Game History Foundation is pushing for, legal solutions to this, to expand exemptions for libraries and institutions, allowing them to, duplicate things, do remote access, stuff like that. So, I mean, again, from our perspective at Digital Eclipse, it's like we can't save video games, because we like it would be like trying to save a forest, but all we can do is like, protect one leaf at a time, essentially. It's great that we can, like, Karateka was not commercially available, is not commercially available. Besides I think there's an iOS version that you can get, but it's like, we're able to do it for a game here and a game there, but that does not solve the problem. But what we're doing is different. It's more along the lines of the games themselves are largely available through piracy, right? But what we can then, it's like, what is the value? What can we then add on top of that? Because, often, if you go and look at the Facebook, ads or Facebook posts for Digital Eclipse, and it's like, hey, we're bringing back Karateka. And inevitably somebody is going to be like, well, I can just download that. Why do I need to buy this? And, I think that's a good question to ask sometimes, because sometimes, the what people are offering is not better or more convenient than piracy. We have to be better than piracy. So again, it's another important reason for doing it the way that we're doing it, because we want to be able to go to people and say, I'm not selling you Karateka. I'm not selling you, Jordan's shooter Death Bounce, which, it's like I'm selling you this documentary. I'm selling you this story. I'm selling you this experience, and I'm selling you like the quality, on the game side of things, the quality of life enhancements that make this the absolute best way to play this. Because and really, even piracy is not a solution, because I think that if you're a person who, it's like, yeah, I've got emulators installed on my PC, I'm relatively, okay with like finding an Apple II disk image and like getting it running in an emulator and all the sort of things you have to do. But I think a lot of people take that for granted. As if you get a Commodore 64 emulator and find the disk image, first of all, there's already a lot of friction just to do that. And then, it's like you got to type, what is it, low. I had an Atari 800 as a kid. I didn't have a Commodore 64. So it's like load, open, quote marks, 8, asterisk. It's like as soon as you get to that sort of stuff, it's like you lose 99% of people who weren't even there downloading a Commodore 64 emulator in the first place. And not only that, but it's like we're moving away from this era of open computer architecture in the first place, which is like, I have a Windows desktop, but like, people's kids today, they've got like a Chromebook from school and a tablet, and you can't even install software on those. Mm-hmm. So it's you can always push through those frictional points if you are serious enough about doing it. It's like you can, yeah, sure. I mean, you can get stuff installed on a Mister or whatever it is, but it's like most people just get stopped by those barriers. And so that's why I always say, like, I want Nintendo to release Mother 3, because yeah, like there's a fan translation of Mother 3. People have played it, but most people are enjoined from playing it because because it is simply, there's too many pain points between you and playing that game, in terms of what's the hardware you're going to play it on, how do you find that fan translation, how do you essentially get the ROM file for the game, and it will not deter somebody who is determined, but it will deter 99% of everybody else. And so to simply like get it translated and get it on the Switch Online app opens, it's like, I played Mother 3, but I want everybody to be able to play. And so it's the same thing with, now it's like everybody can play Karateka in the best possible way. A lot of the Jordan prototypes didn't use joystick controls. So even if, you get one of Jordan's, the Jordan's Asteroid Blaster game or Death Bounce or things like that running on your Apple II emulator, you're sitting there with a keyboard essentially trying to play Asteroids. Guess what? It's not that much fun to play Asteroids with a keyboard, so we're implementing joystick control, stuff like that. So it's just all about, going the extra step, going the extra mile, going the extra 10 miles in some cases with some of the stuff that we're doing to really, make this experience, putting it in the best possible light, not only in the sense of explaining where it's from and doing the documentary style approach, but even if you totally ignore all the documentary stuff and you just jump in, you just want to play Karateka, I just want it to be the best game of Karateka you ever played in your life.
Yeah. And again, a lot of really good points there, especially about, again, like these kinds of barriers. And as you said, like there is that assumption that emulation and piracy is, that's our best solution. But the problem, again, as you said, as what we've talked about, is that it cuts out like so many people who just want, again, to just be able to like turn on a switch or click on something on their computer and say, well, let me check this out. And I never did the Commodore or that era, but I remember doing MS-DOS, and I never want to go back to typing in command prompts to access a game.
Right. Well, so here's the thing. And so, again, like if you had done Commodore 64 back in the day, you'd be more likely to want to get a Commodore 64 emulator in those games now. so many of the sort of classic game re-releases that are out there are console games, and a lot of that is because console games a little bit more universal. Like even with Karateka, when I say Karateka to people who were playing games in the 80s, like, and let's talk about around the world, right? We're making this game about Jordan's Apple II version of Karateka, the original one that he did. We've also included the ports for the Commodore 64 and the Atari 800. But it's like already right there, when you say Karateka, people are thinking of like 3 different games. There's people who played it on the Apple. There's a lot more people who played it on the Commodore because that was more popular at that point. And there were more people who played it on the Atari. And those ports are all very different. And when you talk about, but then like in Europe, a lot of people played it on the MSX or the Spectrum or the Atari ST later on. And in Japan, people played it on the PC-98, which had its own version. In fact, in Japan, a lot of people know about Karateka because there was a Famicom version, an NES version of Karateka, which is widely considered to be like the worst version. But a lot of people played that on the Famicom. And so what is Karateka to those people? And so what I contrast this to Super Mario Brothers. Everybody around the world played the same version of that. So you release that sells worldwide. But with computer games, you don't see as many of those coming out because it's like, well, what version? So we want to include the 3 versions that we can that covers most of what people played, in US and Europe, basically. But then additionally, it's like, we just want to bring back computer games because we see this big opportunity out there. There's tons and tons of great games that were done for personal computers that those ones are even more, endangered or less likely to be re-released. Also, it's harder because a lot of them had keyboard-specific controls. So if you take an NES game that maps to your Switch controller, done. We're taking computer games and mapping them to your Switch controller or your Xbox controller, your PlayStation controller, which is a lot of work. And it's a lot of work for our engineers who have to be really smart game designers also, essentially, to be able to go in and figure out how that, what the best way to do that is. And so again, it's that's like kind of erasing, some of the friction or some of the pain points that are sort of between you and being able to play some of these games. But we see it as a big opportunity because nobody's, really gotten into that, in the past.
And as we said, it's that challenge of trying to take some of these classic games. Again, like a lot of the older games, they were meant for hardware that had maybe 16 kilobytes of memory. Like, they could never even process the idea of getting to megabytes, let alone gigabytes. And as we said, like, part of that challenge when we talk about things from the emulation side is that a lot of emulators and kind of like that space, it becomes harder and harder to kind of maintain these games as, our hardware changes, as hardware evolves. And being able to do something like with the Gold Masters collection, Gold Master series, Atari, Cowabunga, is that it kind of creates like a permanent option for these games. Like, again, when you put Cowabunga or Atari or Kraga on PC, as long as Steam or as long as computers are still around, they'll be able to run this in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. But as you mentioned the article and as what we talked about, the problem with a lot of these games is that there is no other option. Like, even in some cases, like emulation and piracy may not even be enough in 30 years from now to be able to play some of these games.
Well, I'm not even sure that I would even say that, like, you'll be able to play the Making of Karateka easily on a PC 30 years from now. It may, if they upgrade PCs and it falls out of, it may not be something that we're able to continue to update and keep it around. And that is, so even for myself now, making video games, like, I want people to be able to access this in the future. So it's like, once, we need to make sure that there are ways to do that don't simply, that involve libraries or institutions or remote access or, what have you, where that can be made available to people who don't necessarily have the hardware to be able to run it on anymore.
One thing that I would love to ask, we certainly don't have the time to get into, as you've been talking about kind of the technical hurdles of making sure these games can run. Like, I would certainly love, like, again, we don't have the time here, but, like, is there anything you can talk about briefly in terms of kind of like the amount of work that goes into stuff like having a chapter select, having rewind? You mentioned earlier with the Cowabunga collection, being able to zoom in and have it like auto translate as you're getting into like this is the kind of stuff, as we said, that if we talk about this stuff as strictly as bonus features, like no other studio would be thinking about, allowing someone to do like chapter by chapter play of a game. But for like the Gold Master series and for like the other games you Digital Eclipse been working on, like this stuff seems like it's a very important feature. And it seems like there's a lot that goes into, again, presenting this information.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing the engineering myself, but I sit next to the people who are, and I mean, I see how much love and how much effort they pour into this. Because you're right, we don't consider it a bonus feature. We consider it very important and fundamental to what we're doing to have these enhancements, the quality of life sort of improvements to make these games more playable, more accessible. And again, it all just goes back to that, like, treat them with respect, present them in their best possible light, give them their best possible chance to shine. And so, we do that through the interactive documentary stuff. And then of course, through the gameplay stuff as well. So when you're playing Karateka, press start, go to the pause menu, dig around in those options, see what you can turn on, turn off. There's a lot buried there, and it does represent a great amount of work on behalf of counting our studio president Mike Micah, who has gone into these collections and done these tweaks himself. At least like 4 or 5 different engineers have had their hands in this and have worked really hard to behind the scenes to create something seamless. And I mean, we have our own engine. This is done in the Eclipse engine, which is really custom built, for this purpose, to be able to not only ingest a whole bunch. It's like, it's basically built so that it can ingest not only audio and video, but like emulators. We might develop an emulator in-house, or we might go out and license it, from somebody, and we can then take an existing emulator and incorporate it, into our engine. And then we can layer stuff on top of that, essentially. And you'll see that more with other Gold Master Series stuff where, and you actually saw that a little bit of that in Atari 50th anniversary celebration, because we had Yar's Revenge, Mike's new version of Yar's Revenge, which you could press a button to swap back and forth between what he was doing in the original Atari 2600 game, because it was running on top of the original Atari 2600 game's code with enhancements kind of above it, essentially. We'll be doing more of that. We did that in Blizzard Arcade Collection too. I mean, when you're playing 4-player rock and roll racing in widescreen, which is 2 things the Super Nintendo could not do, we're running in the Eclipse engine the Super Nintendo game, and then watching for things that are happening in that game, and then on the fly, like replacing them with other things. And it's and again, I can only really talk about it in layman's terms because have absolutely no idea how any of that works, but I know it does work. And it's something that we're really proud of being able to do, and we always look for those opportunities with every project we come in on. Like, okay, like we're not just running the ROM and then adding the content. We're saying, how can we go in to this ROM? How do we go into these games? And how do we, improve them in some cases from the inside out, while importantly making sure that the default player experience is the game as it was. With Ninja Turtles: The Cowabunga Collection, one of the major things that we could very easily do is not have sprite flickering for the NES games, right? We could set it so that you can have more sprites on screen, and they won't flicker and turn on and off because the screen has exceeded its sprite limitations. But we made sure that when you start up a game fresh, you are playing it exactly as it appeared on the NES, with the sprite flickering, with the slowdown, because that's the authentic experience. Then everything else is an optional enhancement on top of that you would have to go out of your way to turn on if you wanted to do that.
Yep, and again, this stuff is just fascinating to me. Again, as someone who believes in game preservation, who loves being able to appreciate these games, like, I could sit here and chat with you for like the next hour or two easily.
It's fascinating to me. I'm lucky as hell that I get to do it, so I'm just really excited to be here.
All right, but I know we are coming up on time, so before I get to kind of like my final set of questions for you, Chris, anything else regarding the making of Karateka, either from a production standpoint, feature standpoint, whatever, would you like to mention before we kind of go into our final wrap?
You know what? I'll mention one more thing, which is that we've got, we not only have Karateka Remastered, which is a new version of Karateka that our studio president Mike Micah put together because he's so passionate about the game and wanted to do essentially a new port that really tried to preserve the spirit of the original while adding, some cut content. And other fun things as well. But there's also Death Bounce Rebounded, which is taking Jordan's original arcade-style shooter that he was doing for the Apple II that he canceled, and actually taking that to its logical conclusion and turning that into a frantic modern-day twin-stick shooter that is a ton of fun to play. That's one of the just like hidden kind of Easter eggs in this thing because you go in and there's so much about Karateka itself, but like Death Bounce Rebounded is this like really fun twin stick shooter that's like also included. The making of Karateka is also the making of Death Bounce. I mean, it does for this unreleased game of Jordan's. It treats it exactly as we treat Karateka, which is the full array of design documents, video features about it, and and then even a presentation of the original prototypes and a remastered, reinvented version as well. And so that's sort of the hidden story that's in here that you don't really necessarily get when you watch the trailer, but you'll see that as well. So it's something that we're really excited about. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Nice. All right, so with that, I just have a few final questions for you, Chris, and then I will let you go for tonight. So, I guess the first one, I'm sure people are wondering, is there any kind of estimated release date for the Making of Karateka right now?
We're shooting for like sooner rather than later. Basically, we're into like it's done. We're submitting it to the first parties and stuff like that. That does take a little bit of time, but I mean we've announced 2023. A lot of that is simply because we didn't want to announce a date, like far off in the future when it was possible that it will be soon. We just can't announce a date yet because we don't know, because we are simultaneously releasing it on Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, PC, like all those stars have to align before we can definitively say this is the date we can push the button. But like you will not have to wait too long.
All right. So my next question for you, this should be an interesting one. What would be like your like dream, game to do a Gold Masters on? And again, like I don't want to like give you like try to trick you into revealing one that you guys are doing.
Well, this is going to be, I mean, it's the most basic answer I could possibly give you, but like I would want Nintendo to see this and then call me and be like, hey, we want you to do this with Super Mario Brothers. So Miyamoto, you have my number. Just give me a call whenever. We'll make it happen. I mean, yeah, I'd love to do that. And it's like you see every now and again, Nintendo will put up a blog post or something like that, and they'll be like, oh, like, here's a look at some Super Mario Brothers paper design documents that we had in our closet, and and it's a Japanese website, so it's like an 800 pixel wide image, and you're like squinting at it to try to make out the details on this like hand drawn Super Mario Brothers maps. Like they have the stuff. So I mean, I think that there's the Criterion collection for movies, and then that same movie that's given the deluxe Criterion collection edition is also available streaming on Netflix or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's like, what version do you want? You just want to place? We can coexist. Nintendo, I'm pitching you right now because I know you're listening. We can coexist. You know what I mean? You can have the streaming version on the Switch streaming side. You can also do the deluxe interactive documentary, The Making of Super Mario Brothers, ready to go whenever. So just let me know.
And for like longtime fans like watching this, they know like one of my like fevered dreams would be to someday see like a Nintendo game, like a collection available on Steam. Like, that'll be when I can finally, pass on from this world. I can die a happy man when I can actually see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't go in there and tell Nintendo what their business should be, but I think that we would love it. Wouldn't it be fun if, like, that could happen with something at some point of, like, convincing a first party that, like, we should put their games on their competitors, platform or PC, because the idea is no longer about just the game itself. The idea is about reaching people with the story. So I don't know, you know what I mean? It's like, it would be it I would of course want these things that we're making, I really believe in them, and I'd want them to be everywhere. And so yeah.
All right. So with that, I have one final question for you, Chris, and then we'll end things for tonight. And this kind of goes back to, like, the overall kind of like mission statement around game preservation and what, like, Digital Eclipse is doing. When we talked about this, again, for people listening to us right now, that cast would probably be going up at least like a week or two, maybe more than when this cast is. And we were kind of theory crafting what we wanted to see, like, what would be like the first steps towards making game preservation viable and something that's workable. So, as someone who works with Digital Eclipse, as a studio that has really done a lot to present these games, package them in a way to allow them to, like, stand on their own, any thoughts or opinions on, like, where do you want, or where should game preservation go if we want to make this, like, a viable way to appreciate these games, again, more than just a year or two after their release?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer is that there's so many different, essentially, actors, in the space of what would you consider game preservation. It's like libraries, institutions like the Video Game History Foundation, like, they have to play a role. We as a commercial creator of game products, I mean, the best, I'm always thinking, what can I do for game preservation, within this role? And the best thing that I have really, come up with is, it's like, when we get access to things, to materials that are not preserved and not available to the public, we err on the side of making as many of those things available in our product as we possibly can, at the highest level of quality that we possibly can. So, for example, the design documents we were discussing in the Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection, again, if somebody else was making that game, they might have maybe looked at this thousands of pages of design documents and said, okay, well, let me pick out the 10 best ones and we'll put them into a gallery and call it the art gallery. But from our perspective, it was like, let's put in everything. These are literally pieces of paper sitting in a building in Japan, which has the most natural disaster possibility of, like, anywhere in the world, because if an earthquake doesn't swallow the building into the ground, then a typhoon will wipe it out. You know what I mean? Like, it's incredibly fragile just sitting there. So if we have the opportunity in the course of producing this game to get have Konami digitize, all of this stuff and put it into a game that gets released physically, so the digital copies of these things are now out there for I hope that future researchers, even current researchers, are looking at, because they were looking at these design documents and saying, oh, like, we had no idea who made these games. But now we look at this design document and somebody's name is on it. So now for these games where, some of these Japanese NES games didn't have credits, or all the credits were, pseudonyms, like, we're able to put this stuff out there and the researchers are able to go in and figure out who actually made these games. And I feel like that's a huge contribution. And it's something that only I can do because I'm editorial director and I'm the one who's deciding what goes in. So it's like err on the side of getting absolutely everything in there to make these things real proper archives. And like, again, like the Turtles games are out there, but this stuff is not out there. So if everybody can agree that we want to get it out there, and we had amazing partners in Konami who, wanted to do it, then we can do that. So it's the same thing with Karateka and Jordan Mechner's collection of papers, and just erring on the side of getting as much in there as possible, and also designing these games so that it's not overwhelming. Because if you look at the interactive timelines, like we've got timelines within timelines and then galleries within timelines. So there might be like, oh, here's Jordan's 40-page design document for such a game, and it's not in the horizontal timeline. You have to dig deeper to get into the vertical timeline, and then that's a 40-image gallery that's stuck in there. It lets us organize everything in a pleasing way without literally having to have like just a big list of galleries, and then each gallery, it's like by being able to separate it out and essentially create something that's where a player, if they look at that gallery and they're like, I don't have time to go through 40 images right now, they don't have to, and so it's all about like just trying to do it in a way that's not like doesn't present a problem for the player if they don't want to interact with all of that, but that allows the player who does want to go super, super deep, just like going to any museum. You could walk really quickly through the exhibit, or you could spend all day in there looking at absolutely everything. And it's like, how do we enable that? And how do we turn these projects into not just a re-release of something that's already out there on the internet, but that is something that has a lot of value packed into it. And also, I mean, to your point, get stuff out there into the world to be used and looked at by people that otherwise would not have seen the light of day.
Mm-hmm. I think that is a great point to end on for this conversation. Again, if I'm not careful, I will keep you for another hour or two as we just talk about like how important this is. So, with that, if you or anyone else from Digital Eclipse is free in the future, especially after Karateka comes out, or whatever your next announcement is, I would love to have you guys back on, and we can certainly talk more about kind of the work that goes into this.
Thank you. Yeah. You should talk to other people, other people doing other things for sure.
All right. So before we end things, do you have any social media sites, links, whatever that people can find Digital Eclipse, find you, anything? Just go ahead and say it.
Sure. Well, you can find me on Twitter at Kobunheat. It's Kobunheat. If you want to learn more about the Making of Karateka, go to our Twitter at Digital Eclipse, all one word on Twitter. And, probably the pinned tweet will like send you to a page where you can learn a little bit more about what it is we're doing. You can wish list it now on Steam if it's not already. I don't know when you're releasing this podcast, but it probably won't be available until you by the time you release it, so you can wish list it. But yeah, that's those are two good places to start. DigitalEclipse.com. We have a new website that we've totally revamped recently that actually has now individual sort of pages about every one of our projects that we've done. If you want to learn about everything we've been doing since the brand was relaunched back in 2015.
Sounds good. All right. So, Chris, again, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. And as I said at the start, I do believe in game preservation. So this is definitely one that speaks near and dear to my heart. And I do wish you and the rest of Digital Eclipse all the best of luck with Karateka. And I'm definitely excited to see what other Gold Masters you guys have in the wings.
Thanks very much.
All right, so for everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, do the YouTubing stuff people tell you to do. I'm available on Twitter for however long that may be up there. Again, you'll find me as GW Beiser on most platforms. Check out our Discord and Patreon. And again, if you are a developer or someone in the industry and want to come on and talk about game dev, an upcoming project, whatever, please reach out. I'm always looking for guests for these shows. There'll be links to the stuff Chris mentioned down in the description. And with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And until our next show, have a great rest of your night.